Good evening, everyone. If you want to go ahead and get your lesson books out, we are in Lesson 9. Lesson 9, which is page 18 in your books. And we've been working our way through Samuel and talking about Saul and David and their conflict together. And last week, we kind of ended with Saul's very last days and leading right up to the point of his death. But before we really dive into Lesson 9, we had some interesting discussion, and it had just been right at the end of class, so we didn't really have a chance. I don't know if everyone got a chance to make the comments that they wanted to. But we had a lot of discussion about Saul and the fact that he had gone to a medium, to someone who would communicate with the dead for him so that he might attempt to talk to Samuel. And since that's a very different type of occurrence, we don't usually see that in the Bible, I wanted to make sure that everyone had a chance to talk about that if they had any comments or if they had any other questions. So to kick it off, I just want to see if there was anything else that anyone had a question about or a comment about specifically around that particular part of our story. Kim?
He knew what he was doing was wrong in seeking this medium out because it says that he disguised himself.
Yes.
If you're disguising yourself, you're hiding, you're kind of sneaking around, you don't want to be found out because you know you're doing something wrong.
Right.
It talks about in the Bible how many sins happen at night, in the cover of night, to hide.
Mm-hmm.
God sees everything.
Yeah. Yeah, and he obviously would have had to have known that that was wrong since he was responsible for kicking them out in the first place, right? Rick?
And he knows in Leviticus that the punishment for that is death. I mean,
Yeah.
It's not an easy-going thing. Because that means
Right.
you're looking to the wrong source for your guidance and your
Right.
information.
And it even reiterates that in Deuteronomy chapter 18 as well. Anybody else? Okay. Well, that's fine. We can go ahead and move on into Lesson 9. But like I said, I just want to make sure that we had a chance that if there were any other comments, we had a chance to explore that. So Lesson number 9 puts us in 2 Samuel. We finally transitioned from 1 Samuel. Now we're in 2 Samuel. And the first set of questions here come from the first chapter of 1 Samuel. And we're going over, I guess you would say, the after effects of Saul's death here. And so question 1 says, who brought the report of Saul's death to David, and how did this man describe himself? So news of Saul's death has to reach David, and it comes from this man. So how's this described? How's he describe himself? Addie?
He's a man that came from the camp of Israel,
Mm-hmm.
and he had his clothes torn, he wasn't in very good shape.
Yeah. Why do you think that was?
He was in battle.
He was in battle.
He says, I have escaped.
I have escaped.
Escaped with his life, you know.
Yep. That's a possibility. It's also, he's bringing news of a king's death and what was a common practice in the time when you're observing mourning or great sorrow. Tearing your clothes, covering yourself with dust or ash. So it could have been that as well. So either one of those or could have been a possibility.
Both.
Or both, right? Could have been dirty from his escape, from battle, from mourning. But regardless, he comes up to David, and he also identifies himself as an Amalekite, right? So that's going to be important here in just a few moments as well. Now, question 2, we did briefly touch on this last week, but it says, how does this report, so what this man is telling about how Saul dies, how does that compare to what was written in 1 Samuel 31? And did he or did he not tell the truth?
I recall it said that Saul had fallen on a sword and died.
Mm-hmm.
You take that at face value. If he died, then someone else could kill him. So
Right.
This guy's lying.
Right. Yeah, and so it would suggest that this man, this Amalekite, was lying about it, right? Because back in 1 Samuel 31, we're told that Saul fell on his sword and died. Now, some people will try and say, okay, well, the Bible tells me the truth, so I have to make these two match up somehow. So maybe, Saul fell on his sword and was mortally wounded, but hadn't died then, and then this other fellow comes along and finishes him off. Or this man could be lying, right? That to me seems like the easier interpretation, especially because, this guy was an Amalekite. They were supposed to have wiped them out, and he's their enemy. Kim.
Because he was the enemy and he
Yeah.
escaped from Israel's camp. Could he have been a prisoner of war?
Yeah, he might have been. So I think that the easiest explanation really is that the way that we're told in 1 Samuel 31, Saul falls on his sword and dies, and then it says that Saul's servant, who wouldn't finish him off, he saw that Saul had died, and then he fell on his sword as well. So the fact that the Bible is telling that to us makes me, at least, believe that this Amalekite is simply lying. He's trying to bring David news that he thinks is favorable, right? Which gets into question 3. It says, what do you think the messenger expected of David? And then what was David's reaction to this report?
I'm pretty sure he expected some type of reward, at least a good pat on the back.
Yeah.
But instead, David was very, very upset.
Yeah. So you could think of this 2 ways. This man could have thought, well, I've just killed this guy's enemy. These two have been fighting for years, and I've just killed him. So surely he'll be pleased with me. Or it's possible that he thought, well, yes, this was an Israelite king that I killed, but he was suffering when I found him, right? And I put him out of his misery. At least that's the story he's telling. So, maybe David will look favorably upon me because I put this man out of his misery. I did him a mercy. So either way, he's thinking that I'm bringing good news. And yeah, how did David react to that?
David had him killed.
David had him killed. Why?
Well, because he did what David always said he wouldn't do. He harmed the Lord's anointed, right?
He harmed the Lord's anointed, yes. And we've seen throughout all of 1 Samuel just how important that is to David. David's had his own character flaws that we've seen along the way so far. He's not a perfect man, but he has held this one thing very closely, and he hasn't deviated on that. This idea of not touching Saul because he's God's anointed, this is something that David takes very seriously and holds very dear. And I think that a lot of us are the same way. We all have our own faults, and we fail in different areas of life, but there are probably other areas where we're just as strong, and we're really good about a particular command that God gives us. Maybe you're someone who you hate lying, and so you never lie, and that bothers you, and you go to great lengths to make sure that you've always told the truth, whereas someone else might struggle with that, but yet they dedicate themselves towards good works for others, kinds of like maybe community service or something. I don't know. So each one of us has our own strengths and our own weaknesses. I would argue that one of David's strengths was the fact that he respected this particular command so much. Any other thoughts on that particular question? Okay, so we already covered question 4 a little bit. We covered the first part where we said, why was the messenger put to death? It's because he killed God's anointed, and David had him killed for that. But the second half of that says, on whose testimony? So David had him put to death, but on whose testimony?
I don't think his own.
His own, right? His own testimony. Because of what the man said, which we would say is most likely a lie, he was put to death. So, kind of suffering a consequence there. Maybe unintended. Maybe that's not the way that he thought. And question 5 says, what repeated line seems to give the theme of David's song of lament over the deaths of Saul and Jonathan? So David, throughout the rest of the chapter here, he eventually reaches a point and he crafts a song of lament for them. And as he's going through the song, there's one line in particular that keeps popping out over and over again. You think of the songs that you like to listen to, and usually they have a theme, or there's a line that gets repeated in the chorus. Same thing here. There's one line that keeps popping out over and over again.
To me, I think I've read it, but I don't know anything else but verse 25 and 27, how the mighty have fallen.
Yeah, I wrote the same thing. So you can see in verse 19, 25, and verse 27 that David is saying how the mighty have fallen. And so you could apply that equally to Saul and Jonathan when you take that song into context. And so David's lamenting them. And, the fact that they were mighty in more than one way, right? They were royalty for sure. But at different times spiritually too. When Saul started out, he wasn't this crooked character. He might have had some flaws, but he fell a long way in the journey. But there was a point where he was going up and he was on the rise. And so he was God's anointed at one point. And Jonathan, we saw his character, and we've seen a few stories about his reliance on God. And so he fell as well. So what impression do you get from David from his reference to Saul, especially considering the relationship between the two men? So in other words, how did David feel about Saul? Matt?
He's very much honoring him, admiring him, and praising him for his good battle and everything. And he even mentions again the anointed.
Mm-hmm.
He's anointed with oil in verse 21 there. The word for Messiah, some of the types of Christ maybe.
Yeah.
So very, very highly favored.
Yeah, favored, honoring him, respect, all those things would apply. And then in a similar fashion, describe David's feelings for Jonathan.
He loved him.
He loved him, right? Now, it's neat to hear, because when we see Jonathan and David first meet, it tells us that Jonathan loved David as a brother, right? But we're not told that the reverse was true. We gather from their interactions that they were close. We know how Jonathan felt. We don't know if David felt the same way, but we're made certain of that in this chapter. We can see that he loved him, and he says that. He loved him as a friend. Okay, any thoughts or comments or questions before we move on to chapter 2? Okay. I'm hearing silence, so I'm going to take that as we can move on. So question 8. Let me scroll down a little bit here. Sometimes I forget to keep up over here. Oops. There we go. Question 8, civil war. So chapter 2 is about this civil war. So what did David do before he returned to Judah? And how does that mark him as very different from Saul?
He asked God where he should go, and it shows that he wants God's guidance.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, not all, but most of the times that David takes a large course of action, we see this. We see this repeated behavior of him inquiring before the Lord, should I do this? Should I go here? Should I do that? Should I fight these people? And that marks him as very different, because how many times did Saul do that? A couple times in the beginning, but it kind of spiraled down from there. And even when Saul was seeking God's direction, it was usually at all the wrong times, right? We saw that with trying to bring up Samuel from the dead. So question 9 says, what do verses 4 through 7 reveal about the character of David? There's a lot of character questions in this first half of this chapter here.
He blesses them for bearing Saul.
Okay.
And he blesses them that God shows loving kindness, truth, and that their hands be strong and valiant.
Okay. Actually, let's go over to 2 Samuel chapter 2, and that's a short passage, so we'll go ahead and read that. 2 Samuel chapter 2, starting in verse 4, it says, Then the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, It was the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul. So David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead, and he said to them, May you be blessed of the Lord, because you have shown this kindness to Saul your Lord, and have buried him. Now may the Lord show kindness and truth to you, and I will also show this goodness to you, because you have done this thing. Now then let your hands be strong and be valiant, since Saul your Lord is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. So yeah, I think that there are a couple different answers that you could get out of this. I wrote particularly that David was kind, respectful of God's will. The fact that even after Saul's death, he's still showing him respect. He's kind to these men. He's blessing them, as Pat said, because of their good actions towards Saul. Now, question 10 says, when Ishbosheth was made king, who seemed to have been the power behind the throne? First of all, though, who is Ishbosheth? That's a hard name to say over and over.
It says he's a son of Saul.
The son of Saul. But weren't Saul's sons killed in battle? Not all of
I did say
them.
all of them, that's right. Yeah.
Not all of them. That's right. Some of Saul's sons were killed in battle. We know that Jonathan was, and it says his sons. But Ishbosheth was not. And so I've read a few commentaries on that, and I don't know which one is right. I would have to do some more research. Ishbosheth, I think, if I remember right, was fourth son of Saul. And he might have been like the son of a concubine or something like that, maybe, which could have explained potentially why he was not out in battle with the other sons. So that could explain it. But either way, yes, Ishbosheth was Saul's son. And it says, who seemed to have the power behind the throne? So Ishbosheth was not a strong-willed person. So someone else was kind of holding the reins. Who was that? Abner, right? Abner. And who's Abner?
He was the commander of the army.
Yeah, he was the commander of Saul's army, right? So Saul dies, and now his right-hand man, his general, is kind of making some power plays, right? I've got Saul's son, and that's how kingdoms work, right? It's hereditary. So I'll make sure that this guy gets the throne, and I'll kind of drive from behind there. Now, how long did Ishbosheth reign? And then alongside that, how long was David king over Judah in Hebron? 2 years, right? And then David king over Judah for how long?
7.5.
Yeah, 7.5, 7 years and 6 months. How do these numbers relate to each other? I actually don't know the answer to this one, so I'm hoping one of you has it. I looked through there, and I really wasn't sure what the book author was getting at here with this particular one. So I was hoping maybe one of you had some insight. Otherwise, Matt?
I'm not sure, but maybe it's the time that Ishbosheth reigned, and then the time that David was only king of Judah versus his broader reign. Because I mean, they're not the same time frame, right?
Yeah, they're not. I really couldn't make a connection there. I wasn't sure what he was after there. So
And David reigned longer in the big picture. So.
right, absolutely, yeah. I don't know. I'm not sure what he was going for. Question 12. Who took initiative in starting the Civil War? So who kicks things off here? You would think that with Saul dead, David now being king, that we were going to have a little bit of peace for the kingdom, but apparently that's not the case. Who kicks this Civil War off? Abner and Joab. That's a good answer. Who is Joab?
He was one of David's favorite's not the word. I can't come up with the word I want.
Yeah. They don't really list him out as they don't give him a particular title,
No,
but you get the impression that he was one of David's right-hand men, a general or an officer of some kind. He commanded men for David. So I don't know what his exact title would be, but you could easily say that he was one of David's top commanders. So yeah, they kind of kicked this off, although it seems as though Abner may have been behind it, prompting it. And question 13 says, how did Abner propose that this issue be settled? And then does it actually prevent a civil war? They had this disagreement. Now, how does Abner think they should resolve it?
The contest with the 12 men or 24 men or whatever.
Yeah, he has a contest, for all those who keep up on pop culture. Maybe it's like the Hunger Games, they put all these contestants into this arena and they have two teams fight to the death. And apparently they thought that would, or Abner thought that would solve it, or maybe he didn't, I don't know. But does it actually prevent this open war? No? Why not? What's your support for that?
There's a battle after
There's a battle after
that. These
that?
guys just all kill each other. Ta-da! They're all dead, and then they have a big battle anyway. So.
Yeah, I just wrote, if you just go to chapter 3, verse 1, it says, now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. So apparently, this civil war goes on for a little while. This battle of champions, or whatever you want to call it, doesn't actually stem the tide of anything. Question 14, it says, how does this battle end? And what was the result of this long hostility between David and Ishbosheth? I wouldn't overthink this particular one.
Well, in chapter 1, it says that David grew stronger and he grew weaker, so
Yeah.
evidently that was...
Yeah, it seems like it kind of just, obviously David's victorious. It seems like the enemy kind of fizzles out here over time, and David's house continues to be strengthened while Ishbosheth's, or Saul's house, continues to weaken. So, now I think we've kind of gone through some of these setup chapters here in 1 Samuel, and now I think we're kind of getting into some of the meat of this particular book. And really, question 15 kind of kicks that off. Let me flip the page here. Okay. So, Abner ends up breaking this alliance or relationship that he's built with Ishbosheth. Why does he break that? What? First of all, I guess, describe their relationship. We've kind of already touched on it a little bit. Describe their relationship, and then why does it fall apart? Why does it break?
Abner breaks the trust with Ish, whatever his name is, and has his sisters as his own. He has relations with her. He's not happy about that.
Does he?
Accuses him of it.
He's accused of it. Did he really do it, though?
I thought he did. He didn't?
What does it say?
It doesn't really say. It says Ishbosheth accuses him of it. Now, we see Abner's reaction to that accusation. He's very angry. He's so angry, in fact, that he who prompted this civil war is willing to just throw this away, this thing with Ishbosheth, and go over to David's side. He's willing enough to just switch sides. Now, he could have been upset because he's caught in this act and he doesn't like the accusation. He doesn't like what amounts to his flunky calling him out on those things. That's entirely possible, right? Or it could be that he's mad because this flunky has the gall to accuse him of something of this nature, right? That's possible too. In verse 8 of chapter 3, it says, "Then Abner became very angry over Ishbosheth's question and said, 'Am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah? Today I will show kindness to the house of Saul, your father, to his brothers and to his friends, and have not let you fall into the hands of David. Yet today you call me to account for wrongdoing with that woman. May God do so to me, and more so, if as the Lord has sworn to David, I do not accomplish this for him.'" And then he talks about the fact that he's going to switch over and side with David. So the fact that he says, "Am I a dog's head?" A lot of times you'll see in the Old Testament where being called a dog or being related to a dog was a big insult in their culture. And so Ishbosheth is very angry over this insult. So again, that's not to say that this response means that he's innocent. He certainly could have done that. I just wanted to point out the fact that it doesn't actually say whether or not he committed this crime. So we don't know that. We just know that Ishbosheth accused him of it. So any other thoughts on that before I move on? Okay. So now question 16 says, what was Abner's offer to David? What did Abner offer David? Rick?
To bring Israel, all of Israel, to David, so that David would be king over
Yeah, to unify the kingdom, to bring over all of Israel under David's rule. But what condition does David set? He's got some terms, right? He wanted his first wife back. He wanted Michal back. Yeah. And I mean, that could be the first chance that David's actually had to actually get his wife back. We know that in the beginning they loved each other, so maybe they still do, and this is his first chance to get her back. Or it's just the fact that or maybe it's also, this is a convenient thing for David because this kind of legitimizes his rule a little bit more, right? This is Saul's daughter, so it's thinking in terms of political alliances and things like that. So it strengthens his rule. There's really no downside for David here. Rick?
Right. There is no downside. Plus, didn't he pledge that he would watch after Saul's family, and that would still include her also?
Yeah, that's very true.
Just saying, he was honoring that also.
Yeah, so he gets to fulfill his promise, he gets to strengthen his rule, and he gets to get his wife back. So 3 wins for David. This is no downside. So, and of course, Abner fulfills that side of the promise pretty harshly to another guy, right? So Saul, after David had fled, Saul had given Michal to another man, and I did not write his name down. I should have done that. But anyway, he gives Michal to this other man, and then afterwards, when he brings Michal back, this man's like following and crying, and he's upset because he likes Michal. And Abner, we can get another glimpse of that man's character when he yells at him angrily and sends that other husband home, right? So he tells him to go away, pretty much.
Okay, I can't say his name, but it's Paltiel, something like
Paltiel?
that. Paltiel. So.
Yeah, I knew it started with a P, and I just forgot to write it down.
I couldn't pronounce it.
Okay. Let's see. Question 17. What was the attitude of the northern tribes towards David? So first of all, you had to go back in here and remember who the northern tribes were, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know I did. I had to, wait, what is he talking about? And then I had to figure out, okay, who's the northern tribes? Who's the response I'm looking for here? I put, if you're reading through there, I put acceptance, but after some urging from Abner. So Abner kind of coaxes them along a little bit to get them to accept David, but ultimately Abner comes through on that end of the bargain as well in getting everyone united under David's rule. Let's see, how am I doing on time? Okay. Time for one more question, and that's good because I think that this was an interesting one. Question 18, it says, is it likely that Joab, we talked about Joab earlier, is it likely that Joab had more than one motive for murdering Abner? Right? So these two commanders, Saul's commander and one of David's commanders, they had this battle of champions, right? That was their first clash. And ultimately, Joab ends up killing Abner off. So what was his motive for killing Abner, and did he have more than one motive?
Well, we could take Abner's position if he gets rid of Abner.
Okay, so he's eliminating a rival, right? He was one of David's military henchmen, right? And so if Abner comes into the picture, now, that was Saul's second in command, so that's a rival for my position. So if Abner's gone, he has an unrivaled spot. Rick?
Let's see. It's in verse 27, I believe. It says that he struck Abner so that he died to avenge the blood of Asahel, and that's as good as I'm going to do, Joab's brother. In other words,
Right.
His brother had died to Abner. Now that was supposed to be in self-defense,
Mm-hmm.
but here it says he still was avenging him. That doesn't make it right. This was murder, my understanding. So.
Yeah, so back during that Battle of Champions when Abner had retreated, one of the men, Joab's brother, Ashahal, I think,
However you say it.
he was pursuing him. And Abner kind of tried to get him to stop the chase, and he wouldn't. And so ultimately Abner killed him to get away. And so, so he would have been eliminating a rival. He would have been avenging his brother. I actually had one more.
Maybe not trusting him, having been on the other side.
Yes. Yeah, that's the other one I had was he states to David that, what if Abner is a double agent? He was our enemy, and now we're trusting him. He's just trying to get on your good side so he can betray you. And so he tells that to David. One cool fact that I found in this, if you notice, it describes, when it describes Abner's murder, it says that he was taken outside of the walls of the city. So it says, in verse 26 of chapter 3, start there, it says, when Joab left David's presence, he sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the well of Sirah, but David did not know about it. So when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him into the middle of the gate to speak with him privately, and there struck him in the belly, so that he died on account of the blood of his brother Asahel. So he takes great pains to get him out of the city, just past the gate, right? Why would he do that? Was that just a convenient place to murder him? The city that this is occurring at is Hebron, and that's significant. If you turn over to Joshua, back in Joshua chapter 20, Joshua chapter 20 in verse 7, it says, actually, we'll back up to verse 6. Joshua chapter 20 and verse 6, it says, and he shall remain in that city until he stands before the congregation for judgment, until the death of the one who is high priest in those days. Then he shall return to his own city and to his own house, to the city which he fled. So they set apart Kadesh in Galilee in the hill country of Naphtali, and Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim, and Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the hill country of Judah. This passage is talking about the cities of refuge. You couldn't kill, or you weren't supposed to kill or avenge blood when someone was in these cities of refuge. So it seems like Joab was trying to get Abner out, at least to the very edge where he could say it wasn't within the city, to be able to kill him, to avenge the blood of his brother. Because he clearly saw himself as an avenger in this situation. That's all I have for you tonight. Any other thoughts, questions, or comments before we wrap up? Okay. Well, thank you all for your participation and attention, and we'll pick up there next week.
I want to thank Josh for a good class, really engaging in that Old Testament study. Please turn with me to Romans chapter 6. I want to just look through some verses there in Romans chapter 6. Think about the invitation here. Romans chapter 6. Now, you all have studied through this in the Sunday morning class not too long ago, I believe. But let's just look at these verses. What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin, that grace may abound? By no means. How can we who died to sin still live in it? Of course, Paul's talking about grace and all of that. He doesn't want people to be misunderstanding, to think, well, if you can just, hey, the grace is good, let's just have that and sin and have more grace. No, that's not right at all. He goes on to say, do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? We were buried, therefore, with him by baptism into death, in order that, just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life. So there's this sense in which, of course, we understand Jesus died on the cross and was buried and then rose from the dead, that we in baptism sort of reenact that. We put the old man of sin to death, and then we rise to walk no longer in that old, rotten, sinful man, but trying to live that new life for Christ. And he goes on to say, for if we have been united with him in a death like his, we shall certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. Even a bodily resurrection when Christ returns. The dead in Christ will rise. We know that our old self was crucified with him in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing, so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. For one who has died has been set free from sin. So what are we a slave to? Who's our master, right? Are we serving the devil in sin, or are we following God? Now, if we have died with Christ, we believe that we will also live with him. We know that Christ, being raised from the dead, will never die again. Death has no death no longer has dominion over him. For the death he died to sin once for all. But the life he lives to God. So you also must consider yourselves dead to sin and alive to God in Christ Jesus. So he's putting all these things side by side, sort of the situation with Christ and the situation with us, and how through our baptism and then rising to walk in a new life, that we're sort of following in the footsteps of Christ and his atoning death on the cross. Not that we're the atoning death, but we're following that in sort of a tight relationship. And so if we think about even our song that we're going to sing, it asks us, is your heart right with God? Are we looking to continue in sin that grace will just go on and taking advantage of the fact that God will forgive us? That's certainly not what Paul is prescribing. That's not what God plans for us. That's not the purpose of Christ's sacrifice. We're to be buried with him in baptism and rise to walk in a new life and have our heart right with God. So if there are any here tonight who need to be baptized, to be buried with him in baptism and rise to walk in a new life, we want to help you with that. But if there are those who maybe just don't have their heart right, we want to encourage you and help you with that. By all means, that your heart would be right with God. So let's stand and sing this song together, and if we can help you, please come to the front.